This is the morning Sarah Ferguson stops being a bit much and a bit clumsy, and becomes something the tabloids can print forever. Balmoral Castle, August 23, 1992. Breakfast is already laid out when she walks in. So is the stack of newspapers, except every single one is open to the same page. A photograph, grainy, long lens, taken from somewhere she thought no camera could reach. A man's mouth on her foot, her own name, under a headline built to follow her for the rest of her life. She sits down anyway. Years later, a BBC royal correspondent, who covered it firsthand, called that morning utter humiliation for the Duchess of York. She said the Queen summoned Sarah right after, and by Sarah's own account, the Queen was livid. Prince Philip doesn't yell. He just slides the paper her way and says something quiet enough that nobody at the table ever repeats it, even now. She's 32. She grew up being left by people who were supposed to stay, so a room full of silent judgment isn't exactly new to her. It's just louder this time, and the whole country's invited. What she doesn't know yet, sitting at that table, is that this isn't the worst morning of her life. It's only the first. Britain is going to watch her fall like this 5 times over the next 33 years, and every single time, she's going to do the one thing nobody expects from silly Fergie. She's going to survive it. Before we get into the rest of it, if stories like this are your thing, hit subscribe, because what happened to her next is even harder to believe. Here's what you're actually going to watch. 5 moments, spread across 33 years, where Britain decided Sarah Ferguson had humiliated herself beyond repair. The toe-sucking photographs are just the first one, and honestly, they might not even be the worst. There's a children's book so controversial a Queen's own press secretary called her the greatest single threat to the monarchy. There's a sting operation with a fake sheikh, a hidden camera, and £500,000. There's a private email to a man she'd already sworn off in public, one that took 14 years to surface, and cost her everything the moment it did. And there's October 2025, when she lost the one thing she'd held on to since 1986, her title. Every fact in this video is checked against on-record reporting, named biographers, and Sarah's own words, not recycled tabloid gossip dressed up as an insider source. No guessing, no filling in blanks. And by the end, you're going to understand something most coverage of this woman has always gotten wrong. This was never really a story about humiliation. It's a story about what happens to a woman who refuses to disappear. Here's the myth. Sarah Ferguson is the punchline. The redhead who got caught with her toes in some man's mouth, who ballooned up and got mocked for it, who signed her name to a Weight Watchers deal and never took any of it seriously. A woman who brought every single headline on herself and never once felt it. That's the version that sold papers for 30 years. It's also not true, and the record shows exactly why. Sarah Ferguson was 14 when her mother left. Not for a weekend, not for a work trip. Susan Barantes packed up and moved to Argentina with a professional polo player, and on the same day, Sarah's older sister Jane left too, off to start a new life in Australia. 14-year-old Sarah was left behind with her father, in a house that had just emptied out around her. She's talked about what that did to her. Years later, she said she used to leave notes in her mother's dressing room, the kind of note only a frightened kid writes. One of them said, "Mummy, please don't die in a car crash." On September 19, 1998, Susan Barantes was driving home in Argentina when her car hit a truck head-on. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt. She was decapitated at the scene. Sit with that for a second. A teenage girl begs her mother, on paper, not to die exactly the way she eventually did, and then has to live the rest of her life knowing that. That's not a woman who felt nothing. That's a woman who spent her entire adult life being photographed, mocked, and picked apart by a country that had no idea what she'd already survived before she ever put on a wedding dress. The tabloids built silly Fergie out of headlines. They never printed the part underneath. What almost nobody printed alongside the jokes was what she was carrying before she ever put on a wedding dress. Sarah Margaret Ferguson was born on October 15, 1959, to a polo coach named Ronald Ferguson and a woman named Susan Barantes. On paper, it looked like a charmed start. Her father trained polo ponies for the future king. Her mother's bloodline stretched back toward royalty on its own. From the outside, It looked like the kind of family that had everything sorted out. It wasn't. Here's something Sarah didn't find out until she was an adult. Somewhere in her early childhood, her mother was pregnant with another daughter, a baby named Sophie. Susan developed a dangerous complication during that pregnancy, and Sophie died. Nobody told young Sarah. She only learned about her sister decades later. And when she did, she said it finally explained something that had confused her for most of her life. Why her mother always seemed to be carrying something heavier than anyone let on. Then, when Sarah was 14, her mother left. Susan didn't just walk out on the marriage. She left the country. She fell for an Argentine polo player named Hector Barrantes and moved to South America to start a new life with him, finalizing her divorce from Ronald in 1974. And on that same day, Sarah's older sister Jane packed up too, headed for a fresh start in Australia. I lost them both on the same day, Sarah has said. 14 years old, and in a single afternoon, both women in her house were gone. What was left was her father, and by her own account, not a particularly gentle one. She's talked openly about the harsh, dismissive language he used toward her as a kid, the kind of thing she says nobody would let a parent get away with today. She still remembers the exact words. She just doesn't like to repeat them. So when Sarah Ferguson met Prince Andrew in the early 1980s and married him in 1986 in front of a global television audience, it wasn't just a fairy tale to her. It was something closer to a rescue plan. If you grow up being left, you don't dream about a castle. You dream about somebody who stays. She got the wedding. She got the title. Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of York. She got 2 daughters, Princess Beatrice in 1988 and Princess Eugenie in 1990. What she didn't get, according to her own account, and the biographers who've since dug through the marriage, was much of Andrew. Andrew was a serving officer in the Royal Navy, and royal biographer Andrew Lowney has documented just how much of the marriage that ate up. Long postings, long stretches at sea, a husband who was, in practical terms, barely home. Sarah put a number on it herself, years later, blunt as anything. For our marriage, I saw him 40 days a year. 40 days. Out of 365. Think about that math for a second. She'd spent her whole childhood learning what it felt like to be left by the people who were supposed to stay. And then she married into a life where her own husband was gone for 325 days out of every year. She wasn't imagining a happy marriage falling apart. She was watching an old, familiar pattern repeat itself. Dressed up in a tiara. She had married a prince to stop being left behind. Within 3 years, she'd be more alone in that marriage than she had ever been as a child. And the tabloids hadn't even started yet. By 1989, while she was pregnant with Eugenie, Sarah had started spending time with a Texan businessman named Steve Wyatt. According to Andrew Lowney's reporting, the two grew close. Close enough that David Lee, another author who's written on the marriage, later called Wyatt the main reason the Yorks' marriage fell apart, noting Sarah was head over heels for him at a time she felt completely unsupported at home. It wasn't just gossip with no consequences. Photographs surfaced of a young Princess Beatrice sitting on Wyatt's knee. Nothing improper on its face, but enough to raise eyebrows about how close this relationship had actually gotten. Weeks later, on March 19, 1992, Buckingham Palace announced that Prince Andrew and the Duchess of York were separating. 5 months after that, it got much worse. In August 1992, photographers with long-lens cameras caught Sarah on a private holiday in Saint-Tropez with John Bryan, a financial advisor who'd been helping manage her money. The photos showed the two of them kissing, cuddling, and one showed Bryan's mouth on her bare foot. When the Daily Mirror ran them, the tabloids didn't even try to be subtle about it. They just printed it, and Britain lost its mind. You already know what happened next. Balmoral, the breakfast table. Every newspaper laid open to the same page before she even sat down. Here's what didn't make it into most retellings. What Prince Philip actually said. He didn't shout, and he didn't lecture her. He just slid the paper toward her plate and said, "Dry as anything. There but for the grace of God go I." According to people who were there, it landed harder than any shouted lecture could have, because everyone at that table understood exactly what he meant. He wasn't defending her. He was making a point about how thin the line was, and which side of it she'd just landed on. Philip reportedly banned her from royal residences after that. And according to Lowney's biography, Princess Anne was even angrier. Furious enough, by one account, that she wanted nothing to do with excuses. A servant present at Balmoral that week said Sarah acted in the strangest way, seeming almost like she was the wronged party, as if the only people who'd behaved badly were the photographer and the editors who'd published the pictures. Zoom out for a second, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. 1992 was the year Queen Elizabeth herself stood up and called it her annus horribilis, her horrible year. 3 of her children's marriages were falling apart that same 12 months. Charles and Diana, Anne and her husband, and now Andrew and Sarah. On top of that, a fire tore through Windsor Castle that November, causing tens of millions of pounds in damage. The entire institution was cracking, publicly, all at once, and Sarah's toe-sucking photographs became the story everyone could point to and laugh at, because it was easier to laugh at than everything else falling apart around it. The tabloids called it Fergie's foot job and moved on to the next scandal. Sarah Ferguson did not get to move on. It would take King Charles more than 30 years to lift the ban Philip put on her that week. Before we get to the money problems that swallowed her through the 90s, rewind for a second, because there's a scandal here most casual fans have completely forgotten, and it happened even earlier than the toe-sucking photos, back in 1989. That year, Sarah published her first children's book, Budgie the Little Helicopter, a story about a small helicopter who dreams of adventure, inspired by her own flying lessons. It should have been a nice side project. Instead, people started noticing how much it resembled a much older story called Hector the Helicopter, and Random House, the publisher of Hector, reportedly considered taking legal action. It got worse from there. Robin Janvrin, the Queen's own press secretary at the time, was so alarmed by the fallout that, according to John Sargent, the publisher who worked with Sarah on the book, in his own memoir and a later Telegraph interview cited in Andrew Lowney's biography, Janvrin told him flatly that the Duchess of York was the greatest single threat to the monarchy in the current era. Read that again. Not the divorce, not the toe-sucking photos, a children's book about a helicopter, and the Queen's press office was treating it like a 5-alarm fire. Fast forward to 1996, and the marriage that had already been separated for years was formally over. Sarah and Andrew's divorce was finalized, and without a royal income or a working marriage propping her up, the money problems that had been quietly building for years finally caught up with her. Her American business venture, a company called Hartmore LLC, collapsed with debts reported around $1 million. Her personal debts, by several accounts, climbed to somewhere near £4 million by the mid-1990s. She was broke, in the most literal, headline-making sense, behind on payments, chased by creditors, unable to keep up appearances that the royal family had spent a decade insisting she maintain. And the press had already picked her nickname for this chapter of her life, the Duchess of Pork. Not clever, not kind, just cruel enough to stick. She was broke, mocked, and locked out of the family that had given her a title, and the way back in, when it came, would involve losing 50 pounds in front of the entire world. Here's the strange part about hitting bottom in front of millions of people. Sometimes the only way out is to do the climb back in front of millions of people too. Sarah signed on as the international spokeswoman for Weight Watchers, and whatever you think about how it looked at the time, it worked. The partnership, plus a string of book deals, including her 2001 title, Reinventing Yourself with the Duchess of York, gave her the income to start chipping away at the debt that had defined her for most of the decade. In the middle of that climb, in September 1998, her mother was killed. You already know how, and you already know about the note Sarah used to leave in her mother's dressing room as a girl, the one that begged her not to die exactly that way. What you don't know yet is what she did with that grief. She said, looking back, that the loss forced something in her to shift. I am convinced I would never be the strong person I am inwardly had I not had to come to terms with the sense of abandonment, she said years later. Not despite the pain, because of it. Around the same time, in interviews and later in a 2002 profile while doing charity work in Sierra Leone, she opened up about something else she'd been carrying quietly. A difficult relationship with food that she's since described in terms of disordered eating. tangled up in everything from her childhood to the tabloid nickname that had turned her body into a punchline for years. And in the middle of rebuilding herself from nothing, she found an unlikely source of steadiness: her own former mother-in-law. "My mother-in-law has been more of a mother to me than my mother," she'd say later, calling Queen Elizabeth her greatest mentor, a woman who, in Sarah's words, never faltered. By the early 2000s, it looked like Sarah Ferguson had actually pulled it off. Debt shrinking, a career of her own, a relationship with the family that had once slid a newspaper across a breakfast table at her. For a few years, it looked like she'd landed. For a few years in the 2000s, it looked like Sarah Ferguson had actually done it, clawed her way back to solvency and relevance. Then, in May 2010, a stranger with a fake sheikh's headdress asked her a simple question about her ex-husband. Chapter 5. The Fake Sheikh. May 2010. Sarah Ferguson is sitting across from a man who calls himself a wealthy Middle Eastern businessman. He's got the robes, the accent, the whole act down cold. What she doesn't know is that he's not a businessman at all. He's Mazhar Mahmood, an undercover reporter for the News of the World, and one of the most notorious tabloid stings in British history is being filmed right in front of her, on hidden camera. He's already handed her $40,000 in cash, on tape, as a down payment. And now he's asking her a simple question. What would it take to get real access to her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, at the time the UK's official trade envoy? Her answer is the one that ends up in every headline. "Look after me and he'll look after you," she tells him. "You'll get it back tenfold. I can open any door you want." She names a figure, £500,000. She tells him Andrew already knows the terms. "Andrew said to me, tell him £500,000. She talks about how much she's still relying on him financially, how he's had to underwrite her because she's got no money of her own. And she's not being subtle about any of it. It's all right there on tape. When News of the World ran the story days later, it detonated. A senior member of the royal family, caught on camera appearing to sell access to a working royal for cash. There's no version of that headline that doesn't make front pages worldwide. Buckingham Palace moved fast to contain it, putting out a statement that Andrew had no knowledge whatsoever of the meetings or what Sarah had said in them. Nobody was suggesting he'd done anything wrong. The story was entirely about her, and she didn't try to spin it. Her public statement, released within days, was about as direct as an apology gets. "I very deeply regret the situation and the embarrassment caused." She admitted she'd been under serious financial stress. She didn't pretend it hadn't happened, and she didn't pretend it wasn't bad. Here's the thing almost nobody clocked at the time, buried in the same statement. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was drowning. A company she'd set up to manage her American career, Hartmore LLC, had collapsed with roughly $1 million in debt, and the financial pressure that had never fully gone away since the 90s had come roaring back. The fake sheikh sting wasn't a random lapse in judgment. It was a desperate woman trying to solve a money problem the only way she still had access to: her connection to a prince. For 6 years, that was where the story sat. Sarah apologized, the world moved on, and Mazhar Mahmood kept doing what he did, running sting after sting on politicians, celebrities, and public figures, building a career on exactly this kind of entrapment. Then, in October 2016, it caught up with him. Mahmood was convicted and jailed, not for the Ferguson sting itself, but for tampering with evidence in a separate, unrelated drug trial involving the pop star Tulisa Kontostavlos. The case collapsed because of what he'd done, and it turned out that the fake sheikh had built an entire career on tactics that could put people behind bars. That conviction cracked something open. If a court had just confirmed Mahmood was willing to manufacture evidence to get a story, how many of his other stings, including the one that had humiliated Sarah Ferguson on a global stage 6 years earlier, deserved a second look? Sarah thought so. In 2018, she filed a lawsuit against News Group Newspapers, the publisher behind the sting, seeking damages she said totaled up to £40 million in lost earnings, public appearance fees, commercial deals, and business relationships she claimed never recovered after the story broke. The lawsuit spelled it out in detail. Millions lost from cancelled speaking engagements, millions more from a health products deal that fell through, and years of reputational damage that, in her telling, never really stopped costing her. Whether the courts ever gave her back a cent of that 40 million almost doesn't matter for what this story is really about. What matters is this. For 8 years, the fake sheikh scandal sat in the public record as proof that Sarah Ferguson would sell access to a royal for cash. Nobody in the mainstream conversation was asking a harder question, the one her own lawsuit was quietly raising. What if the entrapment that ruined her reputation had been built on the same kind of manufactured evidence that eventually put the man behind it in prison? She apologized, she meant it, and Britain moved on. Again. What almost nobody knew yet was that the money trouble driving her that week traced back to a much darker friendship she'd already tried, once, to end. Here's a question worth sitting with before we get to how this ends. Sarah Ferguson survived cancer twice. She survived 30 years of being the family's easiest punchline, and in October 2025, after everything, she still lost the one thing she'd held on to since 1986. So tell me what you think. Did this family ever actually forgive her? Or did they just wait until it was convenient to stop needing her around? Drop your honest take in the comments. I read every single one. If this is the kind of royal history you actually want, the real record, not the recycled tabloid stuff, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories the right way. And if Sarah Ferguson's story moved you even a little, drop a like before you go.